The village of Muriyad was a place where poverty clung to the people like a second skin, and the sun baked the earth into cracked, thirsty patches. Among the worn-out huts and dusty paths lived Lena, an orphan girl with calloused hands and a heart too soft for the harsh world around her. Her parents had died when she was just a child, leaving her in the care of her uncle, Harish, a man whose kindness had dried up long ago, replaced by bitterness and greed. Lena's days were spent, laboring in the fields, her back bent under the weight of the sun, while her uncle counted the meager coins she earned. She was 18 now, old enough to marry, but no suitors came for her. Who would want a girl with no dowry, no family, and only the clothes on her back? The village whispered about her, pitied her, but no one lifted a finger to help. Then, one evening, Harish returned home with a strange glint in his eyes. "Pack your things," he said, his voice rough. "You're getting married tomorrow." Lena's heart pounded. Married? To whom? Harish smirked. Raghav, the woodcutter. The name sent a chill through her. Raghav was a quiet, ragged man who lived on the outskirts of the village, known for his tattered clothes and empty pockets. Some said he was cursed, others claimed he was just unlucky. No one knew where he came from, and no one cared to ask. The next day, under the scornful eyes of the village, Lena was married to Raghav in a hurried, joyless ceremony. The women snickered behind their hands, and even her childhood friend Vikram, who had once promised to marry her before his family rejected her for being poor, laughed as she walked past. "Good luck feeding yourself with that beggar," he sneered. That night, in Raghav's crumbling hut, Lena sat on the edge of the bed, fighting tears. Raghav didn't speak. He simply handed her a bowl of thin soup, the last of his food, and turned away as if ashamed. But Lena, despite her own sorrow, saw something in his eyes, a loneliness that mirrored her own. She took the bowl, smiled softly, and whispered, "Thank you." It was the first kindness Raghav had known in years. The days that followed were heavy with silence, but Lena refused to let despair take root in her heart. She woke before dawn, mended Raghav's torn clothes, and cooked whatever meager scraps they had with a patience that surprised even herself. Raghav, though quiet, was not unkind. He worked tirelessly, chopping wood, hauling water, doing whatever. Odd jobs the village offered, but no matter how hard he labored, their home remained as bare as the day they had married. The villagers watched them with mocking eyes, whispering that the orphan girl had tied herself to a man who couldn't even afford a proper roof over their heads. But Lena paid them no mind. She had known hardship all her life, and if this was her fate, she would face it with dignity. One evening, as she returned from fetching water, she found Vikram blocking her path, his lips curled in a smirk. "Still playing the devoted wife to that beggar?" he taunted, his eyes flickering with cruel amusement. "You could have had a real man if you'd waited, but now look at you, living in dirt, just like him." Lena's fingers tightened around the water pot, but she forced herself to walk past him without a word. That night, as she sat by the dim light of a single oil lamp, Raghav surprised her by speaking unprompted for the first time. "You don't deserve this," he said quietly, his voice rough with something like guilt. Lena looked up, startled. "Deserve what?" she asked. He gestured around the hut at the cracked walls and the empty hearth. "This. Them. Any of it." There was a weight in his words, a sorrow that ran deeper than poverty. But before she could ask what he meant, he turned away, retreating back into his silence. Weeks passed, and though their circumstances didn't improve, something between them slowly began to shift. Lena noticed the way Raghav would leave the last piece of bread for her, how he'd subtly shield her from the worst of the village's ridicule. And in return, she treated him with a kindness he seemed to have long forgotten, smiling when he returned home, listening even when he said nothing, filling the silence with stories of her childhood dreams. One night, as a storm rattled their fragile roof, she found him staring at the flickering lamp, his face unreadable. "Why do you stay?" he asked suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. Lena didn't hesitate. "Because you're my husband," she said simply. "And because no, one should be alone." Something in his eyes flickered, something like pain or maybe hope, but he said nothing more. Then, one morning, she woke to find him gone. Not just for the day, but vanished entirely. His few belongings were still there, his axe left leaning against the wall as if he'd meant to return. But as the hours stretched into days, and the days into weeks, it became clear. Raghav had disappeared without a trace. The village wasted no time in declaring what they'd always believed. That he was a worthless man who had abandoned his wife like the coward he was. Vikram made sure to remind Lena every chance he got, his laughter sharp as a knife. "Even he didn't want you," he sneered, but Lena refused to believe it. There had been something in Raghav's eyes that last night, something that told her. His disappearance wasn't what it seemed, and then, months later, the rumors began. Whispers of black cars spotted on the distant roads, of men in suits asking questions in the market. The village buzzed with curiosity, but no one thought to connect it to the missing woodcutter or the wife he'd left behind. The rumors grew louder, swirling through the village like a restless wind, but Lena paid them no mind. She had learned long ago that hope was a luxury she couldn't afford, and so she buried herself in work, surviving day by day, her heart hardening against the whispers that Raghav had run away like a thief in the night. The villagers treated her with a mix of pity and scorn, as if his disappearance was proof of her worthlessness, and even her uncle Harish refused to take her back, declaring that she had made her bed and now must lie in it. But then, one evening, as she returned from the fields, her arms aching from the weight of the firewood she carried, she saw them. A line of sleek black cars parked near the village square, their polished surfaces gleaming under the setting sun like something from a dream. A crowd had gathered, their voices hushed but buzzing with excitement, and at the center of it all stood a man in a tailored suit, his back turned to her, his posture radiating an authority that made the villagers step back without being asked. Lena's breath caught in her throat. There was something familiar about the way he held himself, something in the curve of his shoulders that made her heart pound violently against her ribs. And then, as if sensing her gaze, the man turned, and the world stopped. Raghav. But not the Raghav she knew. This man wore his confidence like a second skin, his sharp suit and polished shoes a stark contrast to the tattered clothes he had once worn. His beard was neatly trimmed, his hair no longer wild but styled with deliberate precision, and his eyes, those deep, quiet eyes that had always held shadows, now burned with an intensity that made her knees weak. The villagers gasped, their faces twisting in shock, but Lena couldn't move, couldn't speak, her mind struggling to reconcile the man before her with the husband she had known. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, the air between them thick with unspoken words. And then, slowly, Raghav stepped forward, his gaze never leaving hers. "Liena," he said, her name sounding like a prayer on his lips. The crowd erupted into murmurs, but she barely heard them. All she could focus on was the way his voice cracked, the way his hands, once rough and calloused, now trembled slightly as he reached for her. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice raw. "I never meant to leave you like that." She wanted to ask him 1,000 questions, who he really was, where he had gone, why he had lied, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she felt the sting of tears in her eyes, her body swaying slightly as the weight of the past months crashed over her. Before she could react, a sneering voice cut through the silence. "Look at this! The beggar returns as a king!" Vikram pushed his way to the front of the crowd, his lip curled in disgust. "Did you rob someone to afford those clothes, or did you finally decide to stop pretending?" Raghav didn't even glance at him. His eyes stayed locked on Lena, his expression unreadable. But then, without warning, One of the men flanking him, a tall, broad-shouldered figure in a suit, stepped forward and seized Vikram by the collar, silencing him with a single glare. The villagers gasped, their eyes widening as they realized the truth. This was no ordinary entourage. These were bodyguards, and the man they had once mocked as a penniless woodcutter was someone far more powerful than they could have ever imagined. Raghav finally turned to face the crowd, his voice calm but carrying an edge that made the air grow colder. "For years, I lived among you," he said, his words measured. "I wanted to know what it was like to be judged not for my name or my wealth, but for who I truly was." A ripple of unease spread through the villagers as his gaze swept over them, lingering on the faces of those who had tormented Lena. "And what did I find? Cruelty, arrogance, small minds in a small village." His voice hardened. "But I also found her." He turned back to Lena, his expression softening. "The only one who saw me as a man, not a failure. The only one who treated me with kindness when I gave her nothing in return." The silence that followed was deafening. Lena felt the weight of every eye on her, the shock and jealousy radiating from the villagers who had once laughed at her suffering. And then, with a slow, deliberate movement, Raghav reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. The crowd gasped again as he dropped to one knee in the dust, his eyes never leaving hers. "Lena," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you married a poor man who had nothing to offer you. But if you'll have me, I'd like to marry you again, this time as the man I truly am." He opened the box, revealing a diamond ring so brilliant it caught the fading sunlight and scattered it into 1,000 shimmering fragments. Lena's hands flew to her mouth, her breath coming in short, disbelieving gasps. This couldn't be real. It had to be a dream. But the warmth of Raghav's hand as he took hers was solid, undeniable. Around them, the villagers stood frozen, their faces a mix of awe, envy, and dawning horror as they realized the magnitude of what they had lost, and what she had gained. The village square was so silent that the rustle of the wind through. The trees sounded like thunder. Lena stared at the ring, her mind reeling, her fingers trembling in Raghav's grasp. The diamond was larger than anything she had ever seen, its brilliance almost blinding, but it wasn't the jewel that made her heart race. It was the look in his eyes, the same quiet intensity she had grown to recognize, now laid bare without, the shadow of poverty to hide behind. "You," her voice broke, "you lied to me." The words came out as a whisper, but they carried the weight of betrayal. Raghav's grip on her hand tightened slightly, his expression flickering with guilt. "Not about the things that mattered," he said softly. "Not about the man I was when I was with you." Before she could respond, a commotion erupted at the edge of the crowd. Harish, her uncle, shoved his way forward, his face purple with rage. "This is a trick," he spat, pointing a shaking finger at Raghav. "You think you can come here with your fine clothes and your lies and make fools of us all?" The villagers murmured, some nodding in agreement, their disbelief warring with the undeniable proof before them. Raghav didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he stood slowly, his posture relaxed but his eyes like steel. "Harish," he said, the name dripping with quiet contempt. "I wondered how long it would take for you to show your face." Lena's breath hitched. There was something in his tone, something dangerous. Raghav signaled to one of his men, who stepped forward with a sleek leather briefcase. With deliberate slowness, Raghav flipped it open and pulled out a stack of papers. "Do you recognize these?" he asked, his voice deceptively calm. Harish's eyes darted to the documents, his bravado faltering. I don't know what you're talking about." Raghav's smile was razor-thin. "These are land deeds. Lena's land deeds. The ones you stole from her parents after their deaths, then sold off piece by piece to line your own pockets while she worked like a slave in your house." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Lena's knees nearly gave out. Her parents' land. The home they had left behind. the inheritance she had never seen a single coin from. Her vision blurred as the truth crashed over her. All those years of hunger, of exhaustion, while Harish had grown fat on what was rightfully hers. Raghav's voice cut through her daze. Every acre, every rupee, I've bought it all back. And now, he said, turning to her, it's yours. The villagers erupted. Some cried out in shock. Others turned on Harish, their voices rising in accusation. But Lena barely heard them. She was staring at Raghav, her chest aching with a storm of emotions. Betrayal, gratitude, confusion, and, beneath it all, a fragile, stubborn hope. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do all this?" Raghav exhaled sharply, as if he'd been waiting for this question. "Because the world is full of people who take," he said quietly. "But you gave, even when you had nothing. And I needed to know if that woman truly existed." He reached for her hand again, his thumb brushing over her rough knuckles. "Now that I've found her, I'm not letting go." The sincerity in his voice shattered the last of her resistance. A tear slipped down her cheek, then another. Around them, the crowd's noise faded into the background, the villagers' shock and Harish's spluttered denials nothing more than distant echoes. For the first time in her life, Lena felt something she couldn't name, something like the first light of dawn after a lifetime of darkness. And then, from the back of the crowd, a woman's voice rang out, sharp, familiar, and trembling with rage. "You selfish girl! Did you know about this? Was this your plan all along?" Lena turned to see her aunt, Harish's wife, her face twisted in fury. But before she could speak, Raghav stepped between them, his voice icy. "Careful," he warned. "You've taken enough from her. Today, that ends." The threat hung in the air, heavy and unignorable. For the first time, the villagers truly understood. The man they had mocked was not just wealthy. He was powerful, and he was here to settle every debt. The moment Lena's fingers intertwined with Raghav's, the village square erupted in a collective gasp. The weight of her decision hung in the air like the stillness before a monsoon, heavy with promise and the threat of coming storms. Raghav's grip tightened almost imperceptibly, as if afraid she might vanish like morning mist if he didn't hold on. Behind them, Harish let out a strangled cry. "You're making a mistake," he spat, desperation cracking his voice. "He's playing you for a fool. Men like him don't marry village rats unless they want something." Raghav didn't even turn. With a single glance at one of his security detail, two men in dark suits moved to block Harish's path, their silent presence more threatening than any shout. But it was Lena who spoke, her voice quiet but carrying across the square. "You sold my parents' land. You fed me scraps while you drank away their money." She lifted her chin, something fierce kindling in her dark eyes. "And you dare call him the liar?" The villagers shifted uncomfortably. Old Mrs. Kapoor, who had once refused to lend Lena salt, suddenly found her feat fascinating. Vikram edged backward into the crowd, his earlier bravado gone. The balance of power had irrevocably shifted, and they all knew it. Raghav raised their joined hands, his thumb brushing the calluses on her knuckles, a silent acknowledgement of every hardship she'd endured. "Pack what matters to you," he murmured. "We leave in an hour." As they walked toward the hut she'd shared with Raghav. No, Raghav Malhotra, she corrected herself dizzily. The reality began to sink in. The man who had disappeared into the night months ago was now leading her past a convoy of luxury vehicles worth more than the entire village. Drivers stood at attention. Staff waited with bottled water and shaded umbrellas. Lena's bare feet left faint prints in the dust, her faded sari fluttering against the gleaming black cars like a whisper of the life she was leaving behind. Inside the hut, she hesitated. The clay pots, the patched blanket, the single oil lamp, none of it held value, and yet it was all she'd known. Raghav watched her from the doorway, sunlight cutting across his tailored suit, making him look like a mirage in the crumbling mud. Walls! You kept nothing of yourself here, she realized aloud, running a finger along the rough-hewn table where they'd shared silent meals. His jaw tightened. I couldn't risk being recognized, but I left something behind. From his pocket, he drew a small wooden figurine, a clumsily carved sparrow, its wings uneven but recognizably mid-flight. Lena's breath caught. She remembered finding it months ago by the riverbank, tucked between the roots of a banyan tree. She'd kept it on the windowsill, a tiny spot of beauty in their bleak days. You made this? A nod. The only thing I've ever created that wasn't bought or sold. His voice dropped. I wanted you to have something real from me. The admission shattered her lingering doubts. This man, who controlled empires, had whittled a gift for her in secret. Who was he, truly? The billionaire, the woodcutter, or someone? In between, who had carved out a space for her in both worlds? Outside, an engine revved. Time was up. Lena took one last look around, then picked up the sparrow and the tattered shawl her mother had once woven. I'm ready, she said. But as they stepped into the sunlight, a figure blocked their path. Vikram, his face contorted with jealousy. You think this changes anything? He sneered. She'll always be the orphan we pitied. A rich man's whore now, that's all. Raghav moved so fast Lena barely registered it. One moment Vikram was standing, the next he was on his knees, Raghav's hand fisted in his shirt, their faces inches apart. Say another word, Raghav whispered, the quiet lethality in his tone. More terrifying than any shout, and I'll bury you so deep your own mother won't find your bones. Vikram's throat worked soundlessly. The villagers who had gathered to gawk took several steps back. Lena touched Raghav's arm, feeling the tremble of restrained fury beneath his sleeve. He's not worth it, she murmured. For a heartbeat, Raghav didn't move. Then he released Vikram with a shove, turning away as if the man were already forgotten. But as they walked toward the waiting cars, he spoke so only Lena could hear. They'll never hurt you again. That's my first promise to you. The door of the lead car closed with a whisper-soft thud. Through the tinted window, Lena watched her village, the place that had starved and scorned her, shrink into the distance. Ahead, the road unwound like a promise, and in her palm, the wooden sparrow waited to take flight. The car ride was unlike anything Lena had ever experienced. The seats were softer than any mattress she'd slept on, the air cool and scented with something faintly floral. Through the window, the world blurred past. First the familiar dusty roads, then highways wider than her entire village, until finally the city erupted before her in a dizzying sprawl of glass and light. She pressed her fingers to the glass, her reflection ghostly against the neon signs and towering buildings. Raghav watched her quietly, his earlier intensity softened into something tender. It's overwhelming at first, he said. You'll get used to it. Lena wasn't sure she wanted to. There was something terrifying about how easily the car swallowed distances that would have taken her days to walk. The world beyond her village had always been an abstract concept. Now it was rushing toward her at impossible speeds. They arrived at a building so tall it made her neck ache to look up. The lobby was all marble and silent footsteps, staff bowing slightly as they passed. The elevator ride stole her breath. She'd never been so high in her life. When the doors opened directly into a penthouse, her legs refused to move. Floor to ceiling, windows revealed the city glittering below like scattered jewels. The furniture was sleek and unfamiliar, the kitchen all gleaming surfaces. A vase of fresh roses sat on a table, deep red, like the ones that grew wild near the river back home. Welcome, home, Raghav said softly. Lena turned in a slow circle, her bare feet sinking into carpet thicker than grass after monsoon. This isn't a home, she whispered. This is A palace. A shadow crossed his face. It's just a place. It only becomes a home if you're in it. Before she could respond, an older woman in a crisp uniform appeared. Sir, the documents you requested. She stopped abruptly at the sight of Lena, taking in her calloused feet and faded sari. Raghav didn't seem to notice the hesitation. Thank you, Mira. This is my wife, Lena. Her word is law here. The woman's eyes widened almost imperceptibly before she bowed. Madam. The next hours passed in a blur. Staff came and went with boxes and files. A stylist arrived with racks of clothing, a doctor with a medical kit. Through it all, Lena sat stiffly on a couch that probably cost more than her village's annual harvest, watching as Raghav seamlessly shifted between the man she'd known and the CEO he truly was. It wasn't until night fell and the last assistant left that they were finally alone. The city lights twinkled below, impossibly distant. Lena stood at the window, clutching her mother's shawl like an anchor. You're quiet, Raghav said from behind her. She didn't turn. I'm trying to understand. You left all this to live in poverty? To marry someone like me? His reflection appeared in the glass beside hers, close but not touching. I left because I needed to know if the world had any kindness left in it. And then I found you, giving away your last roti to stray dogs, smiling at children who mocked you, treating a man you believed was penniless with more respect than my board of directors ever showed me. His hand hovered near her shoulder. You were the answer to a question I'd stopped daring to ask. Lena turned then, studying his face. The faint scar near his eyebrow she'd once assumed was from a falling branch. The curve of his lips she now realized generations of wealthy ancestors had passed down. And now? Now that you have your answer? Now I learn how to deserve it. He reached into his pocket and placed a key in her palm. This is yours. The penthouse, the accounts, the company shares, all irrevocably in your name. If you walk away tomorrow, you'll never want for anything again. The metal was cold against her skin. You're giving me an escape. I'm giving you what you've always had. A choice. His voice broke. Even if you choose to leave. Something inside Lena cracked open. In that moment she saw him clearly. Not the billionaire or the woodcutter, but the man who had slept on the hard ground beside her when she was feverish, who had once traded his only blanket for her medicine. The man who was watching her now with the same terrified hope she'd felt standing at the altar in her ragged wedding sari. She closed her fingers around the key. Then, slowly, she placed it back in his hand. I don't need an escape, she said. I need you to teach me how to live in this world, how to walk in these rooms without feeling like an imposter. How to be your wife, not the village girl or the billionaire's bride, just yours. Raghav's breath caught. For a heartbeat, they stood suspended in the quiet. Then he pulled her close, his forehead resting against hers. Then we learned together, he whispered. Outside, the city pulsed with light. Somewhere beyond the glass, her old life was fading into memory. But here, in this impossible place, something new was beginning, not as a poor village girl or a rich man's wife, but as Lena. Just Lena. And for the first time in her life, that was enough.
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.